Hello, Brovs. We're back with Mars Without Venus, a study of some homosexual generals, Major General Frank Richardson. And we begin on chapter 2, if I can find it. This is a rather not short or long, medium chapter, a mid chapter. I'll read half of it just because I have other stuff to read before work today. So let's do it. Choice of career. It should first be re-emphasized that there is nothing in the appearance of most homosexual men which could mark them as unsuitable for any kind of employment. Okay, thanks, Frank. Many, including those often referred to as repressed homosexuals, cultivate an exaggeratedly masculine image. If what Adler called organ inferiority is a factor affecting their lives, he says that there is apt to be an exaggeration of traits which the unconscious mind associates with maleness, such as strength, power, cruelty, and coarseness. It used to be said that such men tended to wear rough, hairy tweeds, smoke big pipes, bagpipes too. That's a faux pas. Maybe it's a double entendre since Richardson himself played bagpipes rather well, I've heard, and grow large mustaches. Today's fashions and the proliferation of facial hair makes this brand of compensation less noticeable. Anton Dolan, Observer Color Magazine, 30th July 78, wrote of Diaghilev, he was homosexual but hated anything that was effeminate. This aptly describes many repressed homosexuals, though Diaghilev, it seems, did not bother to exercise much repression. Some homosexuals choose to adopt a suggestive way of walking, an affected manner, and effeminate postures and gestures, but even these may not be positive means of identification. The great majority of show no signs botching this. Let me take a second here to recover myself and scratch my face. The great majority show no outward signs that they are not as suitable for employment as lion tamers as they are for linen drapers. This occasionally proves to be unfortunate, for men have been engaged for work with small boys or allowed to become scoutmasters and youth leaders who have turned out to be most unsuitable, partly perhaps through being exposed to temptation. But let us remember that only a few homosexual men have any designs on young people, whilst many of them, recognizing their sexual orientation, are dedicated, one might almost say doomed, to a life of chastity. I don't believe that for a moment. To such men, the idea of tampering with boys is as repugnant as it is to be heterosexual men. It is recognized that many homosexual people tend to drift in the direction of the arts, especially the stage or perhaps ballet dancing. Hairdressing is sometimes mentioned, though one might think that this would attract hair fetishes of either sex. Dress designing and interior decorations are on Dr. Clifford Allen's list. The church is a calling said to appeal to homosexual men, presumably because ancient traditions of a celibate priesthood might attract one who has come to recognize that celibacy is for him the safest state. In his case, too, the influence of sublimation, unconscious or partly conscious, may play a part. Failure to achieve a satisfactory adaptation to the sexual instinct with consequent anxiety and tension may lead to feelings of inferiority, or may accentuate such feelings if they are present from any other cause. The unconscious mind may react to such feelings in various ways, including the development of emotional or psychogenic illness. A more positive reaction is what is called compensation, the development of some good personal quality to offset the feeling of inferiority. This can be a useful process, but it may get out of hand when it is sometimes called overcompensation. Thus, the meticulously tidy person with a passion for cleanliness, at times amounting to a washing compulsion, may be compensating for deep-seated tendencies of an opposite sort. The typical conduct of the parvenu betrays an inner lack of self confidence, and the cultivation of markedly masculine qualities may mask an unconfessed awareness of defective masculinity. Many other examples may be found in medical dictionaries and textbooks. A still more valuable reaction is the unconscious process of sublimation. The term was invented by Freud, in which the dynamic energy of the sexual drive is directed into safe or respectable channels, socially acceptable and non sexual aims. Some authorities believe that this is fully realized only in dedicated celibate priests. Others think that this is never complete. It might almost seem that the unconscious mind is emulating the conscious reactions in the classic case of the rejected suitor who goes off to shoot big game or to engage in some other manly pursuit. Sometimes, when a man implies that some early disappointment in love has caused him to turn from women forever, one is tempted to wonder if the faithless loved one ever existed, other than as a fantasy built upon a rather slender structure of experience. Psychologists have seen the influence of sublimation in many people who have been outstanding in the world of art or have in other fields raised themselves above the level of their fellow men. Some have wondered if the greater permissiveness of modern society with its open attitude towards sex may have had the effect of lessening the need for sublimation, thus depriving us of its beneficial results. Graham Heath, referring to a remarkable book by Dr. J.D. Unwin, wondered whether the disappearance of all sexual sublimation in present day Western society may not have checked some other more laudable manifestations of social energy. Willingness to carry responsibility, the ability to forego immediate gratification in order to achieve a higher goal, the self sacrifice needed for the proper rearing of children, a timely reminder of our debt to generations of good parents and to lonely, sex starved, or repressed pioneers of empire and civilization. From the point of view of this book, it is the choice of the armed services with which we are concerned. Throughout history, many thousands of men of varying sexual orientation must have joined armies. You really think it's only thousands? And navies for the sake of the comradeship and the rough, unquestioning acceptance which they offer, especially attractive to men with few family roots and little or no desire to marry and settle down. Barrack room life had a strange appeal to T.E. Lawrence. Many such men have given a lifetime of devoted service, living chastely, one might almost say asexually, with little more thought of sex than a recognition, regretful perhaps, that normal relationships failed to appeal to them. Where officers are concerned, the officers' mess has often been the preferred and almost the only real home of unmarried men. This was especially obvious in my early days in the Army, when early marriage was actively discouraged, made difficult, and, in some regiments, virtually forbidden until what would now be regarded as much too great an age. I remember feeling sorry for a contemporary who, burdened with a young wife, seemed to miss all the fun. Elderly bachelors, as they seemed to me, warming their behinds as they monopolized the fire, booming away about old campaigns, were a familiar feature of the military landscape. They would even caution rash youth against marriage. Kipling understood the army, and had he not said, "He travels the fastest who travels alone," the point which I want to make is well expressed by the distinguished author Philip Mason, who also writes as Philip Woodruff. Much of Victorian greatness was due to celibate schoolmasters, dons, and officers who dedicated themselves to young men. If an element of sublimation has directed many to choose the army as a career, we may be sure, since soldiering is a manly life, that it will always appeal to men, whatever their place in the spectrum of sex. Heterosexuals could well be drawn by the appeal of a smart uniform to many girls, Together with the reputed successes of the brutal and licentious soldiery, whilst every British subject knows that all the nice girls love a sailor, who, if sufficiently successful, may have a wife in every port. Homosexual men, on the other hand, may recognize the armed services as an outlet for the pose of I can't fucking read. Homosexual men, on the other hand, may recognize the armed services as an outlet for the pose of exaggerated masculinity which they have adopted to reassure themselves and to impress others. Finally, of course, Dr. Johnson, as usual, hit the nail on the head when he said, "Every man thinks meanly of himself for not having been a soldier or not having gone to sea." Not true, buddy. As an army man, I can not resist quoting his views on the Navy. No man will be a sailor who has contrivance enough to get himself into a jail. When reminded that some men were fond of being sailors, he replied, "I cannot account for that any more than I can account for other strange perversions of imagination." The great Cham was pontificating in the days of the press gang and the cat o' nine tails, when life in the army was likewise none too cozy. But according to James Boswell, he always exalted the profession of a soldier. Girls who are completely heterosexual may join the forces from similar motives as those which cause young men to join: love of adventure and travel, a smart uniform, and perhaps for the sake of the society of young soldiers. Some may do so in order to live with other young women, and this may cause problems. Where was footnote 5? I'm seeing it at the bottom here. Oh, there it was. Temptations in the yield of facultative homosexuality, see chapter 1, page 23, must have been stronger in the old Navy than in the Army, which may have been in Winston Churchill's mind when he defined naval tradition as rum sodomy and the lash. Nelson wrote in his diary on 20th July 1805, "I went on shore for the first time since 16th June 1803, and from having put my foot out of the Victory 2 years wanting 10 days, 2 years without the society of women must have been of some consequence to the average sailor." Anyway, back to women, young women, heterosexual women in the armed forces. I believe that a happy and successful career for a woman officer is more likely in the case of one who remains completely feminine, in or out of uniform, rather than one who likes to affect a mannish pose, and to get her elbows on the bar to sink a pint with the boys. Brigadier Shelford Bidwell, a distinguished military writer, told me in a personal letter that any suggestions that military behavior may be rooted in the psychology of sex excites a hostile reaction. Such a reaction is predictable but ridiculous. Lovers of the Army may prefer to avert their eyes from its shadier aspects, but they know that an army is just a collection of men, good, bad, and mediocre, embodying the whole spectrum of sexual orientation. A famous fighting formation, the Sacred Band of Thebes, was an exclusively homosexual outfit in which men joined, trained, and fought in pairs. They perished at the Battle of Chaeronea, 2nd August 3038 BC, and Philip of Macedon, surveying the bodies of men and youths, is said to have remarked, "Perish whoever thinks shame of such." An army recruited from the other end of the spectrum, Kinsey Group 0, the exclusively heterosexual males, might have problems, since it has been suggested that it is the element of homosexuality present in most males which lies behind clubs. Masculine society. Let's read that again. Since it has been suggested that it is the element of homosexuality present in most males which lies behind clubs, masculine society, comradeship, indeed male friendship in general. So this guy's saying that homosexuality is part of being a bro. I don't know what this guy's talking about. Without it, we would tend to be in perpetual rivalry like stags, forever seeking to round up as many hinds as possible for our own exclusive enjoyment. Janus, Bess, and Saltus, mentioned in Chapter 1, found that many politicians are closely bound to their mothers, fixated at the adolescent stage of development, and thus often homosexual. 64, is it 0.3? I don't understand what that is. Percent of all United States politicians have a military background. And the authors see the Army as organized, sublimated homosexuality, although I intend to suggest that sublimated homosexuality could have influenced the lives of some eminent military men. I think that this statement is altogether too sweeping. It is unlikely to appeal to American Army men, but perhaps they need not take too seriously the opinions of scientists capable of disgorging the nonsense quoted on page 27. Every now and then in the services, as in civilian life, cases of sexual misbehavior find their way into the newspapers, and sometimes homosexual circles have been uncovered. When we detected one or more men involved in such misconduct, especially abroad in the days when far fewer soldiers were married than is the case today, we quietly invalidated them out of the service with appropriate advice about treatment, unless they had to be brought before courts martial. I am happy to remember a few men who told their troubles to me before it came to that and were helped to adjust themselves in society. Really struggling in this chapter. I hope that I've made it clear that we need not amend recruiting posters to read "It's a Gay Life in the Army," and that the use of such accepted titles as the Gay Gordons need not be followed by libel actions. This observation is not so unnecessary or so flippant as it may appear. Homosexual writers pointing out many examples in which this tendency has coexisted with outstanding ability like to maintain that an increase in homosexuality, if indeed this has occurred, far from being deplored as a sign of national decadence, should be hailed as a source of satisfaction. This is no new fashion. Dante was among the first to point out that many men of genius or great ability had been homosexual. Such men include Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and Tchaikovsky. Carl Jung wrote of a certain pathological effeminacy in the man Wagner, and Wilhelm Steckel added Goethe to the list. Doctors Curran and Parr mention claims by homosexual men that all aesthetic appreciation has roots in homosexuality. Whilst it may well be true that many men have been enabled to make a success of their lives' work by some such deep-seated driving force of which many of them were probably unaware, it is ridiculous to carry such speculations too far, or to allow homosexual writers to claim that their deviation is a desirable thing in the cause of art. The impulse of more normal emotions must be every bit as strong. Brigadier Bidwell, in his book Modern Warfare 1973, wrote, "There is frequently a homosexual bond between the leaders and the led." Of course, he implied no suggestion of anything even faintly improper. He believes from his study of military history that anything to do with war and aggression arouses strong emotions concerned with virility and masculine aggression. Studies of human psychology and of animal behavior support him in this opinion. Bidwell's comment that leaders tend to collect a subgroup of able and brave young men around them is interesting. Military men have always tended to band together in small, closely united groups of comrades who may see themselves somewhat in the light of Dumas's Three Musketeers. There have recently been indications that the importance to morale of the small group of comrades, so well known in military life, may apply also in the broader field of human relations, in industry and elsewhere. Anasander, a Greek general of the 1st century, wrote, "Friends should be stationed by friends, brothers beside brothers, and lovers beside their favorites." This belief was embodied in the organization of the famous Greek phalanx in which a front-ranked man with his rear-ranked man were together called comrades in arms. Comrades in arms. The ancient Greeks being what they were probably found in one another's arms more often than would accord with modern ideas of military discipline. See Appendix 1. I'm not seeing that appendix ever. The principle of keeping comrades together was spelled out at some length in the regulations of the Rifle Corps 1800. Under the auspices of that famous trainer of soldiers, Sir John Moore, more recently have found expression in the so-called buddy training of the United States Army. Shelford Bidwell's subgroup of able young men can be identified even in the higher echelons of command. We see Wellington at his most human and approachable when he was at his forward headquarters in the company of his young aides-de-camp, who galloped countrywide to gather intelligence and to carry his orders. Some of them were called scouting officers, whom he left deep in enemy territory. Men like the well-known Colquhoun, Grant, and Somers Cox. Wellington could be cold and distant, even crushing to some senior officers, whom he regarded as children when he left without his guiding hand. But with these youths with whom he would go fox hunting or ballroom dancing in peaceable conditions, he was relaxed, and his somewhat horsey laugh pealed out. When Somers Cox was killed, Wellington's grief was terrible. 3 times only in his long life, wrote Sir John Fortescue of the death of young Somers Cox, did men see the great Duke of Wellington give way publicly to tears. He had predicted for this young officer the highest success in his career, one of the first generals of England, and his grief-stricken countenance at the funeral was so awful that no one dared to approach him. Something of the same grief must have struck Montgomery when young Johnny Poston was killed in the last hours of the war. The austere field marshal left his faithful and competent staff to do the spade work at his main headquarters, whilst he gave himself up to deep thinking at his tactical headquarters, surrounded, like Wellington, by his young officers. Monty's LO's liaison officers. Woe betide the subordinate general who dared to give one of these brilliant young men the brush off. Monty may not have roistered with his young officers as did Wellington. His bedtime routine and teetotal habits did not permit it, but it seems he was relaxed and genial in their company. And I must stop there before I butcher anymore. Awful reading, but whatever. It's got to be done. Goodbye. Goodbye, Bob.